Hi, I'm Shattered Time, and I just want to talk about team building. I get asked a lot on stream how I do my team building, what do I prioritize, things like that. And I wanted to kind of break down first the roles of Pokemon on teams so that you could apply what other professionals do or what other teams you see, what their roles are, and you can then use it and apply that to Pokemon that you may want to use or understand what their role is on the team in the first place to be able to maybe counter the meta in your own way. So I'm not good at all the visual effects or like making the videos seem like super fancy. So I just kind of wrote it all down and we can kind of go over it, and I hope that that works for you guys. So I think that every single team, every Pokemon is split up into three roles. We have sweepers, we have enablers, and we have disruptors. Okay, so sweepers we'll talk about first, mainly just because I think that everyone knows what sweepers are. They just do big damage, right? They have a pretty straightforward kit. A lot of them are either like max speed, max damage. If you're doing Trick Room, it's like max HP, max damage. And they kind of have their stab moves and then maybe a coverage move and protect typically, right? So like those are what you're looking at with just like your sweepers. Those are typically gonna be where most of your megas come from, just because that's where you get the most stats right now. So things like Swampert, Charizard, things like that, right? That's just the big damage sweepers, okay? And then I was gonna put just supports, but I think supports are split up into different roles, and I think that it's important to talk about each one specifically. So the first one's enablers. So enablers are things that actually help your sweepers sweep. Okay, it puts your team in a better, in a more advantageous position. And I'll show you how that's different than disruptors in a second, but first is like usually it boosts the damage. Things like helping hand, things like weather setting, things like healing your Pokemon, things like that. I think that those are more enabling. So Tailwind, Trick Room, right? They're more enabling your Pokemon and your sweepers to be in better positions. It hasn't really disrupted your opponent from really doing what they wanted to do, okay? And so Pokemon that are, for example, enablers that aren't necessarily disruptors are, for example, Talonflame before they got, outside of like the quick guard that's been added to it, but a lot of Talonflames are really just tailwind setters. Aerodactyl's another big one, is mainly just a tailwind setter and then like a secondary sweeper. So like those are Pokemon that are support mons, but they don't really disrupt your opponent from doing what your opponent wants to do. Okay? And then next is going to be disruptors, and that's the Pokemon that actually do interfere with your opponents doing what they want to do, right? And so they can do that through fake out, encore disable, follow me is a big one, or statuses, right? With like will-o-wisps, um, uh, paralyzing them with like a zap cannon from a Raichu, things like that, right? And so this is where basically every single Pokemon will fall into at least one of these roles, and I think it's important to understand that Pokemon can and probably will fill multiple roles, okay? And so what I want to do next is just kind of talk about popular teams that are out there and how these apply to the teams that you'll see in the meta particularly, so that you can kind of have an understanding of why those teams have such a good cohesiveness. So I wanted to start off first with the last team we saw win an official Pokemon tournament. So this is Francisco Pero's team. I hope I didn't mess up their name. But this is basically a hyper offense team. What that just means is it lacks disruption for more damage. I made some notes so I wouldn't forget anything, but basically you are just trying to do as much damage as possible and just overwhelm your opponent, okay? And so basically every Pokemon you see here will have the ability to sweep, okay? So we have Charizard, Mega Charizard Y, with massive damage, as you probably know if you've played the game. Sylveon also has pretty massive damage in the case of Hyper Voice, with the Pixelate ability. King Gambit also does crazy damage. Basculegion does crazy damage. Garchomp does crazy damage. And then as a secondary Mega, Mega Aerodactyl also does crazy damage, okay? And so that's the majority of what you're looking at is when you're playing a hyper offense team or when you're building a hyper offense team is you want to be able to immediately be in an advantageous situation and immediately put pressure on your opponent and then just compound on that pressure, okay, until you've basically just won. You just overwhelmed them. um, so that's what makes this team really good is it has the ability to do that. Okay, so when you're building the teams, the way to overwhelm your opponents is obviously with massive damage. Okay, in the sense of like Charizard Y with Heat Wave in the sun, massive spread move damage as well because you have Hyper Voice, Heat Wave, Earthquake, um, Rock Slides galore, right? Um, so in the case of what we look at now, like a Charizard Garchomp lead is really impressive because it's just massive damage that you have to deal with turn one, and both of them do crazy damage. So that's what that looks like. And then also in the sense of like the slower Pokemon, like Basculegion, because this one has a Focus Sash, or Sylveon, or even King Gambit, all of them also have priority moves. So even if they were to get in a disadvantageous situation in speed, they can still take advantage of the pressure with Aqua Jet, Quick Attack, which turns into a fairy move through Pixelate, and Sucker Punch on the King Gambit. Okay, so I hope that kind of makes some sense. What hyper offensive teams are typically weak to, they're weak to heavy disruption. Okay, so because they don't do a great job of being able to bounce back from that. So if you have a way to just constantly disrupt their team through intimidates, which is why they have a defiant mon to try to counteract some of that counteract some of that disruption. But intimidate would affect the whole bottom half of that team. Fake outs affect basically everyone on that team that's not Basculegion. If you can redirect them into a bulky mon and that mon can survive, their turn economy gets not as efficient, things like that. So if you can heavily disrupt hyper offense teams, they don't really have a lot of counterplay in that regard. So I believe hyper offensive teams require the most planning, both before the game and like when you're building the team and in actual team select, because those are the teams that are most likely to just lose on lead. Okay, you can just lead wrong with a hyper offense team and just lose the game. But inversely, against a hyper offensive team, you can just lead wrong against them and they can just lose the game, right? Because the hyper offense team just like presses gas and you don't have a way to disrupt what they led with. So I think hyper offense teams, even though they feel very easy to play, they can be hard to pilot and hard to build because I think those games are won and lost more so than other teams before the game has even started. Um, so hopefully that makes sense. This team is built really well just because they cover a lot of their own weaknesses. And higher skill players are usually better at predicting leads and covering for a lot of that kind of stuff. So the skill floor is raised for a lot of hyper offensive teams, which is why you see them a lot on the ladder at high elos or at the end of tournaments in like top 8s and things like that. So hopefully that makes sense. I wanted to kind of discuss another team that is more the opposite and a lot less just kind of all damage, so you can kind of see what that looks like in reverse. Okay, so this is another team that did really well in NAIC. This is a top 64 team at NAIC by Javier Valdez, and this is more of a protect the king comp. So what that is basically is you have very few sweepers. In this case, it's mainly just the Blastoise with like secondary sweeper in Sylveon or Orthworm in very specific situations. But mainly Blastoise is going to be your big sweeper, okay? And then you have a bunch of disruptors and enablers to help boost up the king, okay? So in that case, you have Orthworm with Shed Tail to be able to give Blastoise a substitute. You have Sableye doing Sableye things in the case of Fake Out, Encore, and Disable. And so that is all the disrupting parts. And then Rain Dance in the case of being more of a support, more of an enabler. You also have Rain Dance on the mouse hold, enabling in that spot too. And then you also have Follow Me disrupting there. And then you have Hurricane, Sleep Powder. You have Sleep Powder and Rage Powder. Both of those are disruptors. Pollen Puff can be a damage move, but it's typically a healing move. So that's the enabling piece of it. And so that's what you're looking at with this team. Is it's mostly enablers and disruptors, usually leaning more towards disruption and then allowing your sweeper to sweep. Okay, so these teams are typically more weak to teams that have too much enabling on the other side, because since they lean more towards disruption, if you can't disrupt enough, and Pokemon have a lot more just like self-enabling spots, then maybe you can't pull your opponent down into a situation where their sweeper would be able to be in an advantageous situation. Also, I want to say the caveat of hyper offense beats literally everything if you don't have an answer for it. So I probably won't talk about hyper offense being a counter for the teams in the future, simply because if you don't have an answer for the hyper offense team, it will beat you in like 2-3 turns. Okay, so we're just gonna leave that as a caveat. Just understand that everything can lose to hyper offense if you just don't have an answer for the lead that they put out. Okay, so I'm assuming that you have an answer for the hyper offense team and the lead they put out, because the reason you have all the disruptors, and then at that point, hyper offense shouldn't do a whole lot against you. However, these teams are very susceptible to, obviously, you lose the king, you lose damage immediately. So if there's a time that like Blastoise does die, and the rest of your team is Sableye, Mousehold, and Vivillon, you're probably cooked. So that's kind of what you're looking at when you're building a team like this, is you just want to make sure that you lean more on the disruption and have more answers in your tool belt for things that you will see in the game, because you understand that you have one piece that matters. So you need to do what you can to protect that one piece. And the last team I wanted to show you is one that kind of works in the middle. So this is Trick Room teams. Everyone kind of knows about them. Trick Room reverses the speed order. And so your goal is to initially find the best way to set the Trick Room, because that's your win con, and then have all of your heavy sweepers at that point just kind of do massive amounts of damage. Okay, so Trick Room teams are very linear, like hyper offense teams, mainly just because your goal is to set Trick Room and then do massive damage, right? But the difference is these teams typically have more disruptors, where hyper offense teams typically don't have any disruptors, if so very few, right? But since there is a clear win con to hard Trick Room teams, or just mainly Trick Room teams, they need the disruption to be able to set the Trick Room efficiently. In the case of like Vivillon with Sleep Powder, in the case of Intimidates from Incineroar, or Parting Shot, or Fake Out, things like that allow for Farigiraf to be able to set the Trick Room, also Rage Powder on Vivillon, allow Farigiraf to be able to set the Trick Room more efficiently and more consistently, right? And so you need that disruption, where you typically have very few enablers, because once you get into Trick Room, your goal is to do as much damage as possible inside of those Trick Room turns. And a lot of that can be wasted by having a Pokemon that's primary role is enabling another Pokemon. So that's kind of the slight difference between what you're looking at with Trick Room teams versus traditionally hyper offense teams. Okay, so like I said, has more disruptors to get the Trick Room set. It team's full of sweepers. So you have the Mega Floette, you have Mega Camerupt, and King Gambit. Massive damage across the board. That's why this King Gambit actually has Swords Dance on it. In order to make sure that you're getting that damage down as much as possible. And then typically, this Farigiraf is pretty bulky, but some Farigirafs actually lean a little bit more into special attack. If you feel like your disruption's enough. And in the case of this Incineroar, it's probably max attack. So it's just here to do as much damage when it's in Trick Room as possible. That's what the Flare Blitz and the Darkest Lariat max attack Adamant Nature does. So that's what you're looking at with hard Trick Room teams. So it's kind of in the middle of what you're looking at with the Hyper Offense and the Protect the King comp. Mainly because the win con of Trick Room teams is less the Pokemon and more the board state. Where Hyper Offense, you're just like, the Pokemon are just doing all the damage out the front, and then you have Protect the King where you have one particular Pokemon. Whereas Trick Room teams, your win con is getting the Trick Room set and then just being able to hopefully roll through that. So they're really weak to anything that can prevent the Trick Room from being set. So and that's in the case of Hyper Offense and in the case of just like heavy disruption. But they're mainly weak to things that can survive the onslaught. So if you have Pokemon that are really good at being able to reposition, really good at disrupting, so that the Trick Room team isn't able to just click gas, because once it's in Trick Room, leans more towards the hyper offense side of it. That's when the disruption piece comes in, and then when it's in the disrupting part, when it's trying to set the Trick Room, that's more when just like more damage is better for it. Outside of like taunt and things like that, like to beat it. Outside of this like taunt and things, so that's kind of what you're looking at when you're looking at weaknesses for Trick Room teams. I hope all of this makes sense when you're looking at trying to like build your own team, because each Pokemon has its own role, and I hope that being able to identify what the roles are in these teams in particular allows you to build your own team based off of playstyle you prefer, and then build Pokemon around that to help out. So hopefully that helps. Let me know in the comments things that were really helpful for you, and maybe things that I could go into a little bit more detail on. And I would love to maybe make a new video on what I do in specifics on my team builds, like things that I gravitate to if you are curious. But I just really enjoyed making this video for you guys, and I really hope it helped.